So this is a history of First Plymouth. Actually, the original title was at First Plymouth, the first 149 and a half years, because we did it about 6 months before we had our 150th anniversary, which we're coming up on the 160th in a couple of years. So I did some research, and I also had a lot of help from the archivist at the time. Forget his name. Who was he?
Bob Zeller.
Zeller,
Yeah.
Don Zeller. Yeah.
Don Zeller.
Yeah, he gave me a lot of information. So I found the roots of First Plymouth stretch back to a man named the Reverend William Crawford. As I'll explain, we have Reverend Crawford to thank for the founding of our church, but by a stroke of luck, bad luck actually, we were at the same time relegated to the number 2 spot in Colorado congregational history by the same man, Reverend Crawford. Number 2, First Plymouth. Why? Our very name rails against this. We're First Plymouth, but it could have been worse. For a while, we were number 3. The American Home Ministry Society, a New England consortium of church denominations, sent Reverend Crawford west to organize congregational churches in Colorado. There was a healthy population of Congregationalists in Colorado, but they had to attend services with Presbyterians and Methodists. So to save Congregationalists from this humiliation, Reverend Crawford came to Denver in 1863. But he was apparently greatly disappointed in Denver. In June 13, 1863, he sent a report back home in which he related that he had preached at a Presbyterian church in Denver. And he wrote, quote, "I was strongly tempted to give out that old hymn, 'Lord, what a wretched land is this, which yields us no supply, no cheering fruits, no wholesome trees, no streams of living joy.'" It must have been something about the Babylonian, times in Israel or something. But Reverend Crawford concluded, quote, "Yet some Denverites think they have found the best spot on earth. Poor deluded mortals." I had no idea we used the term Denverites 150 years ago, but apparently he did. So despite the fact that Denver had a number of Congregationalists, the Reverend Crawford forsook all of them, made his way up the hill to Central City, where he organized the first Congregational church in Colorado in 1863. Then in July of 1864, he organized the Boulder Valley Congregational Church. And he finally made his way back to Denver, found it to be somewhat more civilized, I guess, than before. And on October 23, 1864, he organized the first Congregational church in Denver with 12 charter members. It was known as First Church. Boulder Valley later became First Congregational Church in Boulder, and the Central City Church eventually folded. So now First Congregational in Boulder gets to brag that it's the oldest Congregational church in Colorado. And they do. Someone who's apparently been there. First Plymouth could have been the oldest Congregational church, but we missed it by 3 months because Reverend Crawford apparently found Denver a little too coarse for his Eastern sensibilities. So on December 6, 1867, the church decided to build a house of worship. Services had previously been held in the Federal District Courtroom, in the Assembly Room of the University of Denver, then known as Colorado Seminary, and in the partially completed basement of the Baptist Church, which was commonly called the Baptist Dugout. So there was no building on top of it, just a hole in the ground. First Church's first minister was Reverend Norman McLeod. So after it was founded by Crawford, he turned the reins over to Dr. McLeod. Reverend McLeod was the first in a series of outspoken First Plymouth ministers, and the experiences in the Baptist dugout might have caused him to formulate what are today called by many the 3 great religious truths. And some of you may have heard this before. Truth number 1, Jews do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Truth number 2, Protestants do not recognize the Pope as a leader of the Christian faith. Number 3, Baptists do not recognize each other in the liquor store. Or it could be someone else who said that. Ironically, though, the site of the Baptist dugout is now the Rock Bottom Brewery downtown, right across from Jerry's cabaret. Ironically, the site, Reverend McLeod only led First Church's congregation for 3 months. He then went to Utah and he cut quite a swath there. In 1865, he organized First Congregational Church of Salt Lake City. I guess in those days, you didn't have to think too hard for a name of your church. But this was not just the First Congregational Church in Salt Lake City. It was the first non-Mormon church in the state of Utah. As such, it numbered Jews and Catholics among its members, just like First Plymouth does today. Rather than sermons, Reverend McLeod preached what were called tirades against polygamy in the Mormon church. He even opened a safe house for those who wanted to escape polygamy. Only problem was no one apparently wanted to escape. At least none of the men did, as far as we know. These antics did not make Reverend McLeod very popular with the Mormon elders. While he was visiting back east, his Sunday school superintendent was murdered. And a nearby fence post was inscribed, quote, "Damn the Gentiles," end quote. Seeing the handwriting on the post and figuring that it was probably not a message from one of his Jewish congregants, Reverend McLeod did not return to his Utah church, but resumed his pastorate at Denver's First Church. So he came back to this refuge. In 1871, the church raised enough money to buy a building at 15th and Curtis Street, where Sam's No. 3 restaurant now stands. And in 1880, we made the big move of building our own church on Glenarm Place, where the Paramount Theater now stands. The church had seating for 900, which I guess is probably twice as many as we do today. And 4 years later, Myron Reed, one of the most popular preachers of his day, became the pastor. The church was always full when Myron Reed preached, and his sermons were printed in Denver and national newspapers. Reed was called, quote, "the greatest preacher west of Brooklyn," end quote. I don't know who the hell was in Brooklyn, but somebody good must have been there. And his pithy sayings were widely reported and quoted. One of his most famous was, "A man who says he has never had a doubt in matters of faith wears a number 6 hat." These days, that would probably gain him a protest from the American Association of Microcephalics. But I guess in the 19th century, it was considered pretty profound. So a woman, a priest, 2 ministers, and a rabbi walked into a meeting. Now, this isn't the beginning of a joke, but it is the beginning of the story of what might have been our church's finest hour. In 1887, Reverend Reed, Francis Weisbart Jacobs, Monsignor William J. Orion, Rabbi William S. Friedman, and H. Martin Hart, who was the dean of the Episcopal Cathedral, organized the first plan for a unified charitable campaign to collect funds for 10 Denver health and welfare organizations. This interfaith effort was called Charity Organization Society, and it raised $21,700 in its first year. That's over $600,000 in today's money. The concept became popular, and soon chapters modeled after the Denver organization were founded in communities across the United States. Charity Organization Society eventually became the United Way. And if you go to the United Way's website and click history, you'll see Myron Reed's name listed as one of the founders. And I think President Obama came here for the 100th anniversary of United Way and invited George Anastas, our minister, to meet with him. It's a pretty well-known story that during a miners' strike in 1894, Reverend Reed exclaimed from the pulpit, quote, "My sympathies are with the miners, and I hope to God they win," end quote. This was not appreciated by the moneyed members of the congregation, and the next day was his last at First Church. Fortunately, that kind of thing could never happen at First Plymouth today because we pretty much run out of moneyed members. Yes. I found a clipping from the Spokane Washington Chronicle published at the time of Myron Reed's death 5 years later. It described him as having been the minister of the First Church in Denver, quote, "the wealthiest church in the city." We're still wealthy, we're just not technically in the city.
Not Denver.
Yeah, we're not in Denver. In 1884, the same year Myron Reed left First Church, a group of Congregationalists formed a church at 19th and Ogden Streets. They named it the Park Avenue Congregational Church, although it was not located on Park Avenue. But this actually created a valuable precedent, which now allows First Plymouth to claim it's in Englewood when it's really in Cherry Hills Village. The small Park Avenue church suffered a number of financial setbacks, which resulted in a portion of its real estate being repossessed. Their plans for a stone church had to be shelved, and they put up a wooden structure instead. In 1891, the Reverend Frank Bailey became pastor of Park Avenue Congregational, where he would remain for 26 years. He came from Portland, Maine, and in honor of his former church, the Park Avenue folks renamed their church Plymouth Congregation. The church grew quickly, and in 1893, it started construction of a stone church building way further out from the city at 14th and Lafayette Streets. Back in the day, our church published cookbooks as fundraisers. And I found some of these. One published by Plymouth Church in 1892 contains recipes as well as many handy household hints and advice. The hints section begins with this sentence, quote, "If you love your boys, train your girls to do housework," end quote. I can't believe that hasn't been purged from the archives. Here's another quote: "To neutralize poison, administer immediately sweet oil or melted lard. If necessary, lay patient on his back, hold the nose, and pour the remedy into throat and mouth." If necessary, how else would you get this down? And for an inexpensive, natural, organic shampoo, here's a Plymouth Church tip. Quote, "Rub the yolk of an egg thoroughly into the roots of the hair and wash in tepid water," end quote. Here's another one that caught my eye. "To induce growth of hair, melt wax by heating it in a double boiler, add it drop by drop to an equal amount of lanolin, an oily substance derived from sheep's wool. As it congeals, add oil of rose geranium to perfume. Rub daily in the scalp and roots of hair." I don't know how you rub stuff into the roots of your hair, but I discovered this when I first gave this talk 10 years ago, and I've been rubbing this stuff in my head ever since. I got to say, I'm pretty pleased with this. And I have to tell you, finding oil of rose geranium is pretty tough. But meanwhile, First Church decided to move from its 16th and Glenarm property to property it had purchased at 10th and Clarkson Streets. The congregation sold the Glenarm Church and held its last service there on January 13, 1907. And that evening, the church caught fire and was extensively damaged. In what turned out to be a precursor to future interfaith cooperation, First Church then met at Temple Emmanuel while its new church was being built. The new building was dedicated on November 7, 1907. During the next decade, both First Church and Plymouth Congregational experienced weakened financial situations, and they saw an opportunity to combine to create a stronger institution. So in October 1929, the churches merged. Wasn't that right at the time of the crash, October 1929?
Yeah.
A good idea to get together. First Church sold the 10th and Clarkson building and moved into the Plymouth Congregation facility at 14th and Lafayette. Thus was formed First Plymouth Congregational Church. This combined church thrived, and during the 1940s, the church was running out of room in its building. Additionally, the parking situation on Capitol Hill had become untenable. So the congregation decided to move to the edge of the city. So we sold out to the Unitarians and purchased 5 acres of property at Hamden and Colorado Boulevard, where we are now, our present home. First service was held here on November 30, 1958. In 1963, we expanded the building, adding the chapel, Plymouth Hall, and church school space. And in 1993, another building project added new offices and a choir practice room, the Odeon. In 1967, we called the Reverend Dr. Stuart Haskins as our minister. Like Reverend Bailey, he remained our senior minister for 26 years. And we're fortunate that he remains pastor emeritus and is a valued member of the congregation. And I'm not saying that's just because we got Cat as part of the deal, but that was the bonus. The high points of the history of First Plymouth would not be complete without mention of the part we played in the history of another house of worship, Temple Sinai. Ironically, the real beginning of Temple Sinai occurred at Lafayette, where Rabbi Ray Zwerin, an associate rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, was conducting a couples retreat. So Temple Emmanuel, where our church used to have a home, Reverend Rabbi Zwerin was an associate rabbi there. And some of us have probably met Rabbi Zwerin. Most of the participants were not Temple Emmanuel members at this retreat, and interest rose in starting another congregation. Here is part of Temple Sinai's history, which I found on its website. August 30, 1967, Temple Sinai entered into a 9-month lease of First Plymouth Congregational Church for Friday and Saturday use of the facility. The terms were that either party could terminate on 60 days' notice, and the church had the option to request increased rent if Temple Sinai's membership increased beyond 88 families. It did, but they didn't. The small chapel at First Plymouth would serve well for our Friday night services, and the large sanctuary with beautiful stained glass windows, half of which had Old Testament or Jewish biblical scenes, would be used for the high holy days and for other large services. There was a large cafeteria-style room for our congregational meetings, adequate classroom facilities, and a comfortable library, which we're in right now, with a speaker system, which served as overflow seating on the high holy days. Importantly, it had adequate parking facilities. It also had a welcoming minister in Reverend Stuart Haskins, who forged a strong interfaith relationship with Rabbi Zwerin and Temple Sinai. There was a moment of panic the Monday following our first service. The church secretary, Miss Nibby, N-I-B-B-E, no one remembers Miss Nibby, telephoned the temple office to relay a complaint that our group had spilled liquid on the carpet of the chapel. We were always worried that we might alienate the church's powers that be, and not be welcomed back. The problem became less exacerbated when the ritual committee chairman was authorized to present the church custodian, Epi Espinoza, with a bottle of wine on each major Jewish and Christian holiday. So they did it right there in the web. They had no shame. Overlooking the fact that Temple Sinai apparently bribed our custodian, since 1967, First Plymouth and Temple Sinai have conducted a joint Thanksgiving service. It has been conjectured that this may be the oldest continuing joint Christian-Jewish service anywhere in the country. In 2005, I was looking in the Denver Post for the announcement of this service. Readers may have gotten the wrong idea about it due to an unfortunately truncated announcement. It read, on Thanksgiving Day, November 24, the congregation of Temple Sinai and First Plymouth Congregation will be holding a joint. These days that wouldn't matter to anybody. That was quite a typo. Equally important to our community was First Plymouth's founding with a handful of other churches, Denver Inner City Parish in 1960. This inner city mission has for 62 years provided much needed social services, education, and recreational opportunities for its clients. Also in 1960, Kentucky Circle Village, a development of affordable housing for seniors, was opened by Colorado Senior Homes. And once again, First Plymouth was there with other churches to see this project through. And our members continue to serve this important component of the mission of First Plymouth today. Now, the history of First Plymouth is not just moldering away in the archives. You can see it up close and personal. In our sanctuary is a small statue of Abraham and Isaac, a gift from the people of Temple Sinai. And our buildings on Clarkson and Lafayette still stand as impressive examples of period architecture, and they are still occupied as houses of worship. And when, I think around our 150th anniversary, we had a tour of those churches. Speaking of Lafayette Church, a few years ago when researching First Plymouth's history, Janet Rich and Pat Vandermiller were taking a tour of the Lafayette building, now the First Unitarian Church. And they were told that after a 1985 fire damaged the building, The old stained glass windows were removed during the renovation, and new windows, more congruent with Unitarian principles, were installed. The old windows had been donated in 1940 by First Plymouth member William Sweet, a former Colorado governor. First Plymouth had no idea that the windows had been preserved, but Pat and Janet were taken down into the dirt floor basement and shown the crates that contained our old windows, just wooden crates. First Unitarian graciously allowed us to have the windows, and since they had been through a fire in 25 years in the basement, First Plymouth undertook restoration of a few of the windows, only a couple. We retained the grandson of the artist who had originally created the windows, and now a part of First Plymouth's history is gleaming from lighted cabinets near the entry to Plymouth Hall. So those are from the Lafayette Church. One of the fascinating stories about First Plymouth's current building might be titled Our Church's One Foundation. In January of 1958, construction of our church building had just begun. About 12 feet of foundation had been poured when it was discovered that the contractor had used the wrong survey maps to position the building. The foundation had been poured 30 feet east of where it was supposed to be. There was much discussion within the building committee as to how to proceed. The late Chuck Willis was on that committee, and he confirmed to me that this did occur. Several alternatives were suggested, including a lawsuit against Cherry Hills Village, testing the validity of their ordinances, seeking annexation to Denver, or moving the building. The committee decided the most expedient action was to move the building and get on with it. The cost was several $1,000s to remedy, and Chuck couldn't tell me, he couldn't recall who got stuck paying for it. So as we can see over its history, First Plymouth has had its trials and its triumphs. To me, our church history is not just a source of interest and pride in what has been done, but I believe, especially at this point in our church's life, it can inspire us about what can still be done and what we can accomplish if we work together. We've done it before. I think we can do it again. Thank you.
Are you taking questions?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm no expert on
You have an
history. I may not have answers.
You can make things up.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's history.
Yeah.
Everything's on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a, yes.
I was just asking Cindy on the elevator, the bell tower, the Carillon, that was built in when the original church was built, and
I suspect it was.
it's not working, but you have these there.
I didn't know it wasn't working.
No, it's gone. There's nothing up there
Is there
anymore.
nothing?
No Carillon anymore?
No bees.
When there's no bees, well, there's probably bees up there. Gosh, it must have been 10 years ago or so. We were asked to see if we could remove the bees from the tower. So my son Brian and I, we rigged up kind of a pulley system, and we went in there. Well, it's very hot in that tower because the cell phone antennas on top generate heat. They have electrical equipment inside the tower at the bottom, and all that heat just rises. So it must have been great for the bees if they found a hole way in the top. It was nice and warm, so they could, be there all winter. The tower has cross beams, cross iron to hold it up, and it has a ladder that goes up, but it's not like it's a big open space because these cross beams cross all through the thing. And so as we were lowering the bee hive, the beeswax and the bees down, it kind of hit here and hit there. It wasn't a great experience. And I found out that I'm a little afraid of heights, so Brian had to go up there, and he was wearing a suit, so it was pretty hot. And it turned out that we wanted to save the bees, and at that time we had beehives over here in the corner, like we still do. I guess the problem was the people servicing the antennas weren't happy about going up there and having bees buzzing around them. But the beehive, unfortunately, had been infested with wax moth. So it had all this larva crawling in it. So we couldn't save anything. So we brought it all down and we got the bees over to the other hive as best we could. But a lot of them kept buzzing around down here on the pavement, and there was a lot of honey. I mean, there was tons of honey up there, but we couldn't salvage it. It was all infested. And so I think the next day was Sunday at church, and they had something going on out there in the patio, and there were still these bees buzzing around. They're kind of territorial, but unless they fixed the hole that they came in through, and I hadn't heard that they did, there's probably still bees up there, happy as a clam. But so that's something I actually knew. Thanks.
I might add that that's our single biggest source of rental. And the tower and cell phones up there to AT&T, our biggest profit source. Well, I guess I can't say profit because
No, we're not profit.
Get in trouble with it.
I remember the big fight we had about it was up there.
Oh, yeah, they're right. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
Does anybody else been around?
Joe.
I have a story about the building.
Could you kind of refer through some of the prominent members that we've had in town? I know you mentioned former Governor Sweet in the
Pat
1940s.
Schroeder was a member here.
Yeah,
Right.
She lives in
So-
Florida now.
Who's the other representative?
Yeah,
yeah, so the Sopra Sisters,
yeah. I got Healy, of course, but
the Sopra Sisters back in the 60s.
yeah, they were, the Sopra Sisters were they were among the 12 early members.
Yeah,
And they were daughters of a former governor, I believe, Colorado. And their tombstones are pretty easily seen out at Fairmont Cemetery. But
and there's a monument to them at City Park too.
and
And they named the mountain after
the
them.
second minister of First Plymouth, or maybe the third, he got crosswise after he wasn't here very long, and the congregation had to pay him $800 to get him out, which at that time was probably $5,000 or $10,000. Don't recall his name, but and we have the Bailey Fund, which I presume is somehow related to Reverend Bailey. But I don't know.
The Knights. Right.
Yeah, the Knights Chapel.
Tonight, Oregon.
And that was interesting because I think Roger Knight was a banker, and he received a Caring Award. And he talked at the Caring Awards about, we held it up there where we always do at the golf club, Welsher. He said, the last time I've been here was when they announced the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was kind of old. He and his son died within a week of each other.
We also had Claudia Betcher.
Yes.
Yeah, Claudia, that's true.
Bill Betcher, probably.
I think she's
Seriously, still a member.
Could be. She lives in South Dakota, I believe.
Right.
She does now.
Actually, I saw her.
He can give us a report. Yeah.
And visited with her, and she's doing great. For anybody that knew her,
Where did you see her, Bruce?
In South Dakota.
in South Dakota.
Oh, you were in South
In
Dakota?
her assisted living.
Oh, okay. So Claudia is doing good for anybody who wants to know. Yeah, she was a real live wire.
And she just looks the same. She's 89. And she's just old Claudia.
That's great.
And any other names anybody remembers? This used to be the kind of church. It was for DU, wasn't it? We had a lot of DU professors who attended here.
And a lot of eye doctors.
A lot of, too many eye doctors. What we need are more realtors and lawyers. All churches have that problem, not enough lawyers. It's kind of.
Well, with all the eye doctors, we've got good vision.
Yeah. I've gotten some good free medical advice at a travel club meeting once. Yes, it worked out real well.
So any former moderators have stories that they want to tell? If you go into the Covenant Room, you'll see the rogues gallery of all the former ministers, except there's a gap. In what, 1990 or wherever. And Adrian, you want to say anything?
Yeah.
Oh, only he was asked to leave.
Oh, that was.
The golf.
Yeah. Yeah, I was moderator.
Yeah.
So-
Have an interesting relationship with our minister. Edward Manthai
Oh,
was our confirmation leader.
Oh.
In Western Springs, Illinois,
When you were in confirmation?
in our junior high years.
Was anyone here when man?
I was.
You were.
well, when I joined, Manthai was here,
Wow.
1965.
Okay. I've heard the name, but that's all.
And I have to say, when Ron Segal was asked to leave, the congregation came forth and a retired minister from Wyoming. Somebody remember the name?
Ben Smith.
Ben
Yeah.
Smith, and an associate woman minister who was here said, we can do this. And so they provided the pulpit support, and the rest of the congregation just came forth and really provided wonderful service, and it was just continuing.
And so.
That was Roy Smith. Roy Smith. Ben Smith was after Stewart.
No,
Yeah, when we
but Ben
joined.
Smith was Wyoming.
Ben Smith was in Wyoming, from Wyoming, was a retired
Was,
minister.
old classmate of Stuart Haskins at Yale.
Who was?
Roy Smith.
Roy Smith.
Roy Smith.
Yeah, they were the two-
Roy Smith had to be the one that filled in when Ron Stegall left.
No, Ben. Smith.
No, Ben Smith was the interim.
When Stewart.
He was our first hire. Ben Smith was the.
What's
interim.
on second?
When we joined, Ben Smith was the minister. Yeah.
Anyway, Bob, you have all the support, you have all
At
the
least your
support.
name isn't Smith, Bob. We'll be able to keep you straight. Right.
And Ben Smith.
I'm intrigued that a pastor was paid to leave. I gotta work out. But one thing that's intrigued me about this church, which you kind of mentioned a little bit, is and its mailing address is Englewood. And you said that at one time this was Englewood or whatever, or and recently it's been branded as, First Plymouth, Denver, even though it's located in Cherry Hills Village. And I'm kind of curious
And
about.
Englewood, Bailey.
Post office.
The post office called it Englewood because they have a post office there.
Is it? Yep.
Cherry Hills at one time was, their post office address was Englewood,
Oh, okay.
and it got changed.
Yeah.
And you were part of that.
But we like to think we're in Denver, actually. Too bad when that foundation thing came up, they didn't annex just across the street. It would have been a little easier, I think.
Yeah, life would be easier for,
Been a lot easier.
and it would be easier for solar and a lot of things.
You probably all heard the story about Rabbi Zwerin, who was telling his congregation where to go as they were building their church. And he said, well, go to Hamden and Colorado Boulevard and southwest corner. There's a building with a T on the top of it.
And Temple.
Yeah.
And we used to have a tea in our sanctuary, but now we shipped it down
Mm.
to the chapel. I think that's where I last saw it.
Any other stories? Any other stories?
Stories. Okay, so much for the history.
Terrific, thanks. Well, our tradition is that we stand and say the Lord's Prayer at the end of the meeting, so. And I don't know if we can do a circle, but. We could try.
It takes some work. Can't be done, I guess.
Oh. Get around.
Thank you.
All right.
There we go.
All right. Our Father, Creator in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Give us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial. Deliver us from evil. The kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours now and forever. Amen. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, ladies.
I know.